They said I couldn't live alone, but I'm better than ever. My daughter-in-law called me a useless old woman at dinner. The next day, she lost her job because I owned the company. When my husband passed away, many thought I wouldn't last a month on my own. They said I was fragile dependent, that I always needed to be under someone's care. My own family started treating me as if I had ceased to exist. But the most painful blow came from where I least expected it. My daughter-in-law. At a family dinner in front of everyone, she called me a useless old woman. That silenced me on the outside. What no one knew was that, behind my calm appearance, there was a woman with history, with intelligence, and with a voice. And at that moment I decided I would no longer be treated as invisible. What happened next completely changed the way I see myself, how I live, and how I am seen. Today I am more independent, stronger, and more serene than I ever imagined. If you have ever been underestimated, judged, or pushed aside just for existing, this story is also yours. I'm happy to have you here. Follow my story to the end and comment the city you are watching from so I can see how far my voice has reached. Ever since Lawrence started visiting me more frequently, I noticed that something had changed. He wasn't the same attentive son as before. His tone was more serious, his questions more incisive. He started commenting on household bills, on grocery expenses, as if expecting explanations. What used to be conversations between mother and son turned into a kind of domestic audit. At Sunday lunches, the atmosphere was no longer the same. Instead of memories and laughter, the topic was always financial. He questioned whether I still needed the housekeeper twice a week. He commented that the heater stayed on too long. With soft words, he tried to convince me that he was just trying to help me. But the discomfort began to grow like a dense cloud. And yet I remained silent. What hurt me wasn't the concern. It was the tone of command disguised as care. It was as if I was no longer capable of making decisions. The intimacy between us gave way to a strange distance. I no longer recognized the man sitting on my living room sofa. Sometimes I found myself remembering when he was a boy, hugging me and saying I was his hero. Now, he looked at me as someone to be managed. The first time I noticed this clearly was when he asked how much I still had in savings. I didn't ask why. I just answered with cold numbers. I felt as if I were answering a bank manager, not my son. With each conversation, a piece of the respect between us disappeared. I kept silent, but the discomfort grew silently, without alarm but constantly. Does he really believe all this is normal? Everything became clear one afternoon when Lawrence arrived with an envelope. He said he thought of a more efficient way to take care of my future. I opened the papers and saw it was a joint account application. He explained that this way we could centralize the resources, and that it would be safer for me. I looked at him and saw conviction, or perhaps coldness. He said it was for my own good, and that he would know how to manage better. I tried to argue lightly, saying I didn't need it. But he insisted with a serene smile and firm words. "You'll feel more at ease, Mother. I guarantee it." It was as if he had already decided, and under pressure I smiled back. I pretended to be convinced, while something inside me awakened. It was a spark I hadn't felt in a long time, that of self-protection. I held the papers in my hands for 2 days, without signing anything. He called me, demanding answers, asking if I needed help filling them out. I said I was reflecting. Inside, I already knew what I would do. But I also knew I needed more than indignation. I needed proof. And above all, I needed to act intelligently. My pain couldn't be loud. It had to be strategic. I did what he didn't expect. I said yes. An empty, superficial yes. Just to buy time. I said I would take the papers to the bank, that I would handle everything myself. He accepted, satisfied, and finally relaxed. At that moment I realized how much he wanted control, not my peace. At that moment I said yes. But inside something lit up. I found Richard's contact on an old card. He had helped me years ago with the inventory documentation. He was a calm, direct lawyer but with keen eyes. I called and asked for an urgent appointment. When we met, I told him everything from the first changes to the joint account proposal. He listened in silence, taking notes, never interrupting. When I finished, he took a deep breath and said, "You're right to act now." He advised me not to sign anything at all. He said many women only sought help when they had already lost control of everything. He guided me to record every conversation, every message, every suspicious movement. This was called legal protection, and that's what I was doing. We went further. Richard explained how to recognize patterns of emotional manipulation. He used the term emotional blackmail, and I felt as if he were reading my life. Everything made sense. The excessive kindness, the favors followed by demands, the paternalistic tone. It was a subtle plan of domination, and now I had a name for it. And more than that, I had support to face it. I left the office with an empty folder and a head full of ideas. What seemed impossible the previous week was now taking shape. I would have to continue acting normally with Lawrence. But, behind the scenes, I would document every step. Calmly, strategically, focused. My life would not be stolen from me without resistance. Richard looked me in the eyes and said, "We're going to do this the right way." I was going to fight. In silence, but with all my strength. I started slowly. I chose to sell furniture he wouldn't immediately notice. An armchair in the corner, the old sideboard in the dining room. I wanted to see what he really perceived. On his first visit after the changes, he only commented that the house seemed emptier. I smiled and said I was redecorating. He didn't react, just frowned. I kept testing. I sold the hallway cabinet and a piece of furniture from the guest room. The environment began to breathe more, and so did I. But it was when I got rid of the main sofa in the living room that everything changed. Lawrence arrived unannounced and upon finding the empty space, exploded. He yelled that I was being irresponsible, that I needed to inform him of such decisions. As if I owed him explanations. His reaction was so intense it scared me. Not by the volume but by the control he believed he had over my house. He said it affected the property's value, that I was devaluing our patrimony. I didn't remember sharing my house with him, but clearly he thought he did. There I saw something I had never noticed. He believed everything was already his. The anger in his eyes lasted longer than necessary. Even when I tried to change the subject, he persisted. He talked about responsibility, prior consultations, and that this wasn't how family decisions were made. I just listened. There was no point in arguing. But inside, the certainty solidified. I was right to be suspicious. He yelled as if I had sold the entire house. 2 days later, Erica showed up. The doorbell rang in the morning, and she appeared with a cake and a polite smile. She entered without waiting for an invitation and sat down as if it were her own home. She said she was concerned, that Lawrence had commented on my strange behavior. She used a calm, almost sweet tone, but there was something in her eyes that didn't match her words. She suggested that I was being influenced by outside friends. She talked about neighborly gossip, about comments in family groups. She said everyone just wanted my well-being. And then, with all delicacy, she suggested that I sign an authorization for Lawrence to make decisions for me in stressful moments. I smiled, thanked her, and said I would think about it. It was no surprise. Erica always had a calculated air. Now, the partnership between her and Lawrence was clear. Her visit wasn't out of affection, but out of strategy. They came to gauge my resistance. And they probably didn't like what they found. She said goodbye with a cold kiss and the promise that she would return soon. I stood at the door for a few minutes after she left. The room was brighter, more spacious. But what impressed me most was the echo of silence. It was a necessary emptiness, a pause between battles. I knew they would return, and they would return with more force. But I was also preparing myself. No fake smile would fool me anymore. Her tone was sweet, but her eyes said otherwise. I bought a new notebook and named it Dossier. I noted every reaction, every misplaced word, every attempt at persuasion. I logged dates, times, even the clothes they wore at each meeting. Richard told me that details mattered, and I followed his advice to the letter. I printed cell phone conversations, scanned notes and bills. I started reviewing my bank statements more carefully. Any unusual transaction I investigated. Everything was potentially useful, and each recorded item was a stone in the path of those who tried to erase me. At night I reread everything. It was like watching a puzzle form before my eyes. The pattern was there, and it was clear. I was no longer the same woman who remained silent for fear of causing conflict. Now my silences had purpose. I observed and planned. Fear had given way to analysis. I no longer waited for the storm, I prepared for it. And all the accumulated tension would turn into legal ammunition. I knew something bigger was coming. The house was emptier, but my heart was fuller. I walked through the rooms with my head held high. The furniture no longer protected me, and it didn't need to. It was my posture that now made me strong. I wanted to tear down all the curtains, let the sun in without asking permission. The light did me good. And silence was my ally. I no longer expected Lawrence to understand. I no longer wished for Erica to change. I wasn't trying to fix anyone. I was rebuilding myself. And for that, the space needed to be clean. Without excesses, without distractions. Just the truth, raw and unadorned, on every wall, in every step. That night, I sat in the empty room and closed my eyes. I took a deep breath. I smelled the wood, the fresh air circulating. It was a new house even without renovations. Because the transformation was internal. It was mine. And nothing, no one could take that from me. The house was empty, but my courage began to fill every corner. Lawrence kept calling me, visiting me, trying to gauge my reactions. But I remained silent. No explanations, no confrontations, just neutral and distant answers. He interpreted this as surrender. He relaxed, believing his influence had defeated me. But, in reality, my silence was armor. With each word he spoke, I observed more clearly who my son had become. He thought my quietness meant acceptance. But he didn't realize that behind every contained yes, there was a record. I was noting everything. The patterns, the times, even the inconsistencies in his speeches. My silence was a net in which he entangled himself. What advantage is there in being underestimated? All of them. It was then that his tone changed. Lawrence began to question my memory. He said I was confused, that I didn't remember conversations correctly. He claimed that everything he did was to protect me. He used sweet words, but behind them there was guilt, distortion, and veiled threat. I began to realize that this had a name: gaslighting. Once, when I subtly confronted him about something he had said, he interrupted me firmly. "You're confusing everything, Mother. I'm just saving you from yourself." That echoed in my mind for days. How can someone invert reality with such conviction? I no longer had doubts. I was dealing with a manipulator, and a skillful one. His strategy was clear: to make me doubt myself. And that was more dangerous than any financial demand, because it messed with the root of my autonomy, my lucidity. But now I was aware. And with it came my defenses. I started recording snippets of conversations, always with my cell phone in my pocket. It wasn't madness. It was precaution. "Don't you see? I'm saving you from yourself," he said. One late afternoon, while watering the plants on the porch, Alice, my neighbor, came to the gate. She commented that recently she heard muffled arguments and saw Lawrence leave my house always with a heavy expression. She spoke cautiously but with concern. She asked if I was okay. For the first time, I felt like telling part of the truth. I told her the bare minimum. I said I was dealing with something delicate, but that I was being advised. Alice then offered herself as a listener and witness should I need it. "You know, I've lived here for over 10 years. If something gets out of control, I can help." Her presence, until then discreet, became a new pillar of strength. From that moment on, I also started recording the days and times when she observed something. Having her there, available, gave me security, an invisible yet firm ally. I couldn't trust many, but I could trust Alice. And that made all the difference. I wasn't as alone as I imagined. Over time, my silence ceased to be just a shield. It became an active strategy. Every time Lawrence spoke too much, I spoke less. And every absence of response was a mirror, where he saw himself without reflection. The dynamic changed. He began to tread lightly, trying to maintain the control that slipped through the cracks of my silence. In the quietness of my house, I planned with precision. I organized timelines, sifted through old papers, searched for bank data. Every detail could be a key. My mind, once occupied by guilt, now worked with logic. I still felt pain. He was my son after all. But that pain was no longer paralyzing. It was fuel. My silence ceased to be fear and turned into strategy. I returned to Richard's office on a rainy Monday. I brought my folder with records, the notebook, audios, and screenshots. I sat before him and told him about Lawrence's new behavior and Erica's visit. I spared no details. I spoke of their glances, insinuations, distortions. Richard listened to everything with his usual calm, but with doubled attention. When I finished, he crossed his arms and said, "It's time to go beyond the surface." He recommended that we investigate my financial records from recent months. He said it was common in cases like mine for there to be strange movements made with the victim's data. I shivered inside, but I agreed. It was time to know everything. Time to open the vault. And I'm not just talking about the bank, he said. In the following days, we reviewed statements, invoices, contracts. And that's where the truth began to emerge. 3 service accounts were being debited in my name, although I had never authorized them. A card statement I didn't recognize. And most frighteningly, a $5,000 loan taken out months earlier, using my CPF, Brazilian Individual Taxpayer Registry. I never saw that money. Richard analyzed the documents and said firmly that it was fraud. The name was mine, but the signature clearly not. We took the case to a handwriting expert who confirmed it was not my handwriting. It was as if someone had appropriated my identity. What started as emotional control now had criminal ramifications. The shock left me speechless for a while, not only by the amount but by the audacity. Using my name, my CPF, my life as if they were theirs. Lawrence and Erica were not just emotionally pressuring me. They were, in fact, stealing. That went beyond any family justification. It was a crime. The name was mine, but the signature was not. With each new discovery, our dossier took shape. Richard organized the information into numbered folders, separated by type of infraction. I continued gathering elements at home. I scanned everything. I updated my notebook with dates and observations. We were building a precise, undeniable timeline, and at the same time strengthening the judicial case. The process was exhaustive but liberating. Each document was a symbolic return of my autonomy. Each recorded piece of evidence was a silent response to years of control. I started sleeping better, even with a heavy heart. Because finally, I was ceasing to be a hostage to become the author of my own story. Each sheet was a brick against the lie. Deep down, I always wanted to believe I was exaggerating, that perhaps Lawrence was just too protective. But now, with the evidence before my eyes, there were no more doubts. It wasn't care. It was invasion, appropriation, deception. A castle of manipulations built with sweet words and rotten intentions. And that castle was about to crumble. I looked at the dossier on the table and felt something new. It wasn't anger nor sadness. It was firmness. I knew the path would be long, but I was ready. For the first time, I didn't feel vulnerable. I felt prepared. And that for me was already a victory. His castle began to crack. Lawrence called me in the morning saying he needed to talk to me, urgently. He didn't explain why, just said he would come over at the end of the day. The way he spoke sounded like a warning, not an invitation. I took a deep breath and replied in a calm voice. "I'm not feeling very well today. Can we reschedule for another day?" He hesitated for a second and just replied with a dry, "Okay." I spent the rest of the day thinking about my answer. It wasn't a complete lie. I really felt tired. But above that, I felt the need to impose a pause. A limit. This wasn't a simple conversation between mother and son. It was a summons to regain control. And I knew that if I said yes, he wouldn't see it as kindness but as surrender. Night fell and he didn't appear. Just a brief message. "Let me know when you can talk." His lack of complaints surprised me but also worried me. His silence at that moment seemed more dangerous than any explosion. It was as if he was retreating to set something up. I remained vigilant, noting every move. The game was getting quieter but no less dangerous. Feigning indisposition was a test for myself. I wanted to know how I would feel saying no, even if it was indirect. And I realized that, despite the initial anxiety, relief came later. Maybe this was the way. Saying no firmly, even if my heart trembled. "I can't today," I said. But he heard never again. 2 days later, Erica started sending me messages. They were short, polite in tone but laden with meaning. "Hi, Mother, Lawrence mentioned you're more distant. Is everything okay?" Then, "If you need anything, we're here. Always." And then came the phrase that bothered me most. "You're not alone, Mother." In any other context, it would have sounded like affection. But here it felt like surveillance. I knew how to decipher those subtexts. She wanted me to feel guilty. She wanted to remind me that they were watching, waiting for me to back down. But I wasn't alone by accident. I chose to be alone. And for the first time, this solitude gave me freedom. I no longer sought approval in every gesture. I sought respect. I read and reread each message before replying. I thought about ignoring it, but I knew that silence could also be misinterpreted. So I replied politely and coldly, "I'm fine, thank you for asking." It was the first time I exchanged words with Erica without feeling inferior. Not out of pride, but out of clarity. I knew she wasn't worried about me. She was worried about control. The day went on and the messages stopped. But the tension lingered in the air. They were watching me, perhaps waiting for a relapse. I, on the other hand, watched back. And I noted it down. The game now was one of resistance. Who would give in first? "You're not alone, Mother." But it sounded like a threat. That week, I decided to set my own rules. I sent a direct message to Lawrence. If we want to maintain a good relationship, I asked that future meetings be arranged in advance, with defined date and time. Took me hours to write that sentence. Every word was chosen carefully. I didn't want to seem hostile, but I needed to be clear. He read the message and didn't reply for almost 2 days. When he finally responded, he simply said, "Understood." No attempt to dispute. No passive-aggressive comment. Just an understood. This, to me, was more eloquent than any argument. For the first time, he realized that things were changing, and that I wouldn't go back. That same night, I reread all my documentation. The messages, the audios, the statements. Everything began to make sense like a big puzzle. And most importantly, it began to form a real shield against any future manipulation attempt. I wasn't reacting on impulse. I was building a well-founded response. Strong even if silent. Imposing that rule was a turning point. For the first time, I not only defended my space, I defined it. And although it seemed like a small gesture, it was the bravest I had made since the beginning of this journey. The silence on the other side was deafening. For the first time, he heard a no. It was Saturday morning when I heard the doorbell ring. I peeked through the curtain and saw Lawrence standing at the door. My heart raced. We hadn't made any plans. I took a deep breath and went to the entrance. I opened the door just enough to see him. "Hi, Mother. Can we talk?" he said. I kept the door ajar. My gesture was simple, but it spoke volumes. He noticed. His eyes searched for an opening, literal and emotional. But I remained firm. I said it wasn't a good time. "It'll be quick," he insisted. Still, I didn't open the door further. He started talking even from outside. A rehearsed speech, a practice tone. He said everything he did was for my good. That he was worried. But none of it sounded new. I just listened. I listened and recorded. Mentally, every word became evidence. He continued, "You're not well, Mother. You're making confused decisions. People are talking." My stomach churned. But on the outside I was stone. That wasn't concern. It was subtle blackmail disguised as affection. I had heard this before. This time I wouldn't absorb it. Even with the door ajar, I felt there was an entire wall between us. And that wall was necessary. He tried to smile, but it was a sad, almost cynical smile. And then with a sigh he blurted out, "You owe me everything you have," he whispered. For a moment, I thought about closing the door right then. But I stood firm. He expected me to shrink, to cry, to back down. Instead, I took a deep breath and said, "Lawrence, I have everything documented. Every transaction, every decision in my name. I know what's happening." He paled, but tried to maintain his composure. I continued, my voice low yet firm. "You have 2 options. Either you return everything you took without my consent, or you will be reported." He took a step back. For the first time, I saw hesitation in his eyes. As if, for a moment, he saw the woman I had always been, and whom he tried to erase. The tension hung in the air. I trembled inside, but I didn't show it. He shook his head slowly, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. But he said nothing. He just stood there, motionless, before a new version of the mother he thought he controlled. And I finally was free from the need to please him. Those words broke a cycle. I wasn't pleading. I was demanding. For the first time, I looked at him as an adversary, not as a mother. And the adversary was ready. He took a step back. He didn't expect that. He stood there for a while longer, as if trying to find a way out. But there were no more openings. The door, which once symbolized entry and welcome, now marked limits and protection. I said, "If you want to talk about serious matters, find me with a lawyer." His eyes widened, unsure if this was real. And it was. It was definitive. There were no shouts, no tears. Just silence. A silence full of ruptures, of declarations that needed no words. He nodded, turned, and left. The sound of his footsteps going down the stairs seemed different. No longer imposing, but hesitant. I leaned against the door and took a deep breath. For the first time I felt strong there at that threshold. I stood there, eyes closed, feeling the cold wood against my back. It was as if the entire past was outside trying to knock on the door. But I wouldn't open it. That house, that body, that life, now they were mine. Entirely mine. No longer available for manipulation. I closed the door calmly. I locked it, turned the key, and stood in silence. Outside, the world could keep spinning. Inside, I had just been reborn. The door closed. And with it, the old Patricia. The following weeks were filled with waiting and anticipation. Richard had already requested the formal documents from the banking and public service institutions. When the first envelopes arrived, I opened them with trembling hands. There they were, statements with forged signatures, loans signed in my name, movements never authorized. With each page, my indignation gained legal contour. I wasn't crazy. And now I had proof. We scheduled a meeting with the manager of one of the banks. He was polite but direct. He said the signatures did not match the old documents in my registration. He commented, without mincing words, that if a complaint were filed, the institution would have to cooperate with the investigation. My heart pounded strongly but also steadily. This was what I needed, proofs. Justice is not made with assumptions. It begins with papers. Richard organized each document into numbered folders. I was instructed to keep copies at home, both digitized and printed. The clarity of the facts gave me new confidence. What was once only anguish was now evidence. My son, my own son, had deceived me, but the truth was finally beginning to speak for me. And most importantly, it wasn't just my voice, it was official. The manager's final sentence was, "This is a crime, Mrs. Whalen." 2 days later, Lawrence made his first post. An old photo of me with the caption, "My mother is going through a difficult time. I ask for prayers. She is not well." The comments came quickly. "Strength, Lawrence. Family is everything. We are with you." I felt a knot in my throat. The use of compassion as a shield was cruel. He wanted to manipulate the narrative before I could tell the truth. I sat on the couch and read every word in silence. My heart heavy. Part of me wanted to respond, to write everything there, to open everyone's eyes. But Richard had already advised me. Don't step onto his stage. Your truth is in the forum, not on the feed. Still, it hurt. To see friends, colleagues, strangers treating me as sick, as incapable. When, in fact, I was more lucid than ever. Erica also published something subtle. Taking care of those who took care of us is not always easy. But we do it with love. The blow was twofold. First, they painted me as fragile. Then they positioned themselves as heroes. The inversion was cruel. But now I understood. This wasn't about me. It was about control. And about preventing the masks from falling. They knew they were on thin ice. The pain of unjust exposure was real. But there was something stronger. The conviction that my truth was documented. And that weighed more than any comment. The papers I held were cold but reliable. Unlike social media. There, whoever yelled loudest won. But in court, whoever proves wins. My heart was heavy, but the papers weighed more. I remained silent. I didn't respond publicly. I didn't send indirect messages. I just called Richard and requested a new meeting. He received me with his usual serenity. He said he had seen the posts and that it was predictable. When the truth begins to emerge, they yell louder. But yelling is not the same as proving. I nodded. And then we organized the next step. Gathering all the attachments for the formal lawsuit. We spent hours reviewing every detail. It was a complex puzzle, but the pieces were already fitting together. Bank documents, call records, messages, all in chronological order. Richard was confident. "We're going to build an undeniable timeline," he said. I felt a calm relief. For the first time, the burden wasn't just mine. It was shared with someone who knew how to turn pain into concrete action. I left the office that afternoon with a strange feeling. It was as if I was going to war, but truly armed. Not with shouts, not with tears, not with scandals, but with evidence. That was new to me. I had always been the one who conceded, who reconciled, who kept silent. But now my silence was the preparation for the final word. "We will show, not argue," he said. His game was social. Mine was judicial. The decision came with the force of an inevitable choice. Richard called me for a more direct conversation. "Do you want to resolve this privately or officially?" I thought of everything. The time I lost, the broken trust, the nights of forced silence. There was no more room for hidden agreements. I took a deep breath and replied, "We will file a public civil action." The tone of the conversation changed. Now it was official. Irrevocable. He explained that the process would be public, that anyone could follow it. This, in itself, would be a response to the campaign on social media. I nodded. There was no more shame, only a desire for justice. Fear, which was once my guide, was now just a distant echo. Deciding to make everything public was a step that required courage. But there was no other way. Transparency was my new shield. When the news reached Erica, she couldn't hide it. She called with a trembling voice. "Patricia, please think carefully. This will ruin his reputation." She kept repeating that it was a moment of crisis, that everyone makes mistakes, that there was no need to expose everything. I listened without interrupting. And then, with the same firmness with which I locked the door weeks earlier, I replied, "He started it. Now the truth will finish it." She still tried to appeal. She said Lawrence was regretful, that everything had been misinterpreted. But the words no longer stuck. I had lived long enough to recognize a sincere apology from an attempt to contain damage. And that call was pure containment. I ended the conversation politely. But inside, a cycle was closing. Erica was no longer an intimidating figure. She was just part of the past that I had decided not to carry. I hung up the phone and felt as if I had cleaned an entire room of my soul. Emotional manipulation was a powerful tool, but it lost its strength when the truth asserted itself. And at that moment, the truth was ready to come out of the shadows. "This will ruin his reputation." "He started it," I said. Richard filed the lawsuit on a Wednesday morning. The paperwork was perfect, complete, aligned. Each page carried the weight of months of pain and resistance. I saw my name printed at the top of the process, and for the first time it was not followed by doubts, it was followed by evidence. It was my name saying, "Enough." My name demanding respect, justice, reparation. That same day, the first notification was sent. It was the beginning of a new stage. The wait for the impact, for the reaction. But there was no more anxiety, only focus. The woman who started this story full of doubts was now determined. And even if new pressures came, I would not go back. This was not about revenge. It was about self-respect. And it was finally on paper. I returned home with a copy of the lawsuit in my hands. I put it in the drawer of the living room cabinet, right where I used to keep the bills. Now, next to the bills, there was justice. The papers continued to protect me, but in a deeper way. Now the truth was not just mine, it was public. From then on, there was no turning back. Justice had my name. The notification was delivered at 9 in the morning. Lawrence called me 30 minutes later. His voice fluctuated between indignation and desperation. First he said everything was a mistake. Then that it was unnecessary to expose myself that way. Next came the audios. In one he denied everything. In another he asked for forgiveness. In all of them, he sounded more concerned with the repercussions than with what he had done. "You're throwing everything away, Mother," he said in one of the audios. "I love you, but you're exaggerating." I remained silent, listening to every word as if they were the last of an old version of him. Finally, I heard what I didn't expect. "Tell me what to do. I'll do anything." But it was too late for improvisation. Justice had already begun its course. I played the audios for Richard, who merely took notes. This shows desperation, and an attempt to reverse without admitting guilt. That was it. Lawrence was not denying out of conviction, but out of fear. His panic did not come from regret, but from the loss of image. The man who told me what to do was now lost, and he was beginning to understand that control had changed hands. He said, "I'm innocent," in the same tone as "forgive me." In the following days, the public lawsuit gained traction, not because of my actions but because of his. Mutual friends began to see the documents. Some remained silent. Others sent discreet messages saying they were surprised. But soon comments appeared on social media, now not in support of him but questioning. "She just wants justice," someone wrote. It was like watching a wave change direction. The likes decreased. The defenses disappeared. Even the most loyal began to fall silent. The post that said I was confused was deleted without warning. And in his bio, the prayer requests disappeared. The persona he built began to crumble before everyone's eyes. And he finally stopped talking. Erica also disappeared from social media. No stories, no enigmatic phrases. Their silence was different from mine. Mine was strategy. There's consequence. And there I understood the weight of truth. It doesn't need a stage, just time. And now the time had come. They could no longer hide. The mirror was broken. "She just wants justice," someone wrote. It hurts to see a son dismantle himself like this. Not for his pride but for the bond we once shared. For everything we built. For who he was in childhood, at birthdays and spontaneous hugs. But I could no longer look only at who he was. I had to face who he had become. And especially who I was becoming too. I watched his fall with steady eyes. Not out of coldness but out of survival. If I let myself sink with him, nothing would change. So I took a deep breath and continued. I reinforced the documents. I organized deadlines with Richard. And I maintained enough emotional distance not to annul myself. He was my son, yes. But I was also someone with a name, history, and dignity. The woman who once lowered her eyes now held her own gaze. And even with a heavy heart I knew I had made the right choice. It wasn't about winning. It was about not losing myself anymore. It was my pain but also my victory. I still loved my son. But I loved myself more. The following week, Richard called me for a meeting. He said he had received a settlement proposal. Lawrence proposed returning the full amount of the embezzlement, $17,000, and issuing a public retraction. I listened in silence. It wasn't immediate relief. It was more like the end of a long, bumpy road. I asked, "Is it fair?" Richard replied serenely, "It is sufficient." I asked for time to think. I went home and sat on the sofa. I looked at the folder with documents, evidence, recordings. All the ground covered. The silence, the humiliation, the contained anger. And I thought of women like me who have no support, no evidence. That wasn't just mine. But it was also mine. And accepting the settlement was ending the fight at the right time. Without hatred. With firmness. I accepted. We returned to the office for the signing. Lawrence was there, silent, with his eyes downcast. There was no hug, no sentimental words. Just papers. Signatures. And finally the phrase I had waited months for. "I apologize for everything I did to my mother." It was written. Official. Visible. An apology that came late, but it came. And he knew it was the least he could do for what he had done. I left the room feeling light-bodied and full-hearted. Not with joy but with peace. That peace that comes when you do the right thing, even if it hurts. I no longer carried anger, nor a desire for revenge. I carried dignity. The name that was mine was now also my symbol of victory. He wrote, "I apologize for everything I did to my mother." I returned home at dusk. The sky was copper-colored. I sat in the backyard where I had so often cried in silence. But this time I just breathed. The air was the same. But I was no longer the same. My life wouldn't be perfect. But it would be free. Free from fear, from manipulation, from poisoned silence. Free to be who I am, with the mistakes and successes that belong to me. I closed my eyes and gave thanks. To God, to myself, to the path I chose. I thought of everything I endured, everything I documented, everything I was able to rebuild. The pain still resided within me, but it didn't dominate me. Now it only reminded me of what I overcame, and what I will never accept again. I took a deep breath, as if returning my strength to the world. The story that so many tried to control was now only mine. And the ending was not written with revenge, but with courage. A silent, methodical courage that won without shouting. That won with paper, with strategy, with faith. I closed my eyes and breathed. For the first time in years. It wasn't revenge. It was freedom. Now, I'm curious about you who heard my story. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Have you gone through something similar? Support the channel by subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing this video. I'm leaving another story on the end screen that you'll also enjoy, and it will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.